Today on the Let's Talk Thyroid podcast, I am chatting with Whitney Morgan about all things gluten. And does it really matter? Like, what's really the big deal with gluten and thyroid health? I think if you know you've got a thyroid problem and you've been investigating diet and lifestyle, I'm sure you will have come across removing gluten as part of that. Certainly, if you've been listening to other or watching other episodes of the podcast, you will have heard me talk about it or others, but what really is the big deal? Well, Whitney Morgan is very, very passionate about going gluten-free and educating people with Hashimoto's, autoimmune disease, celiac, about how to go gluten-free, why to go gluten-free, what's the difference between celiac disease and gluten sensitivity, how do you test for it, can you really be gluten-free if your household isn't gluten-free? That one was a challenging one for me. So we've covered all of these different topics, plus we've talked about how gluten sensitivity can show up in our body other than in our gut. So things like, brain inflammation, brain fog, mood disorders, joints, skin, a whole host of other different things. So even for those people that say, look, I've cut gluten out and I didn't notice any difference, I think there's still something in here for you. Maybe it will be challenging. Maybe it will cause you to go digging deeper and looking at more information, which I think is fabulous. That's what we all need to do, is take all this information and go digging a bit deeper. So I really want to thank Whitney for joining me on the show today. We had a whole lot of fun. It's quite a long episode, and I've actually left a few extras here in the video that aren't in the audio, so it is like a few minutes longer, but I think you'll find that it's jam-packed full of lots of really practical and positive information, because that's what this show is all about. So I hope you really enjoy it. Hi, and welcome to the Let's Talk Thyroid podcast, where we discuss different aspects of living a healthy thyroid lifestyle, positively and practically, so that you can really thrive and not just survive. So join me, your host, Annabelle Bateman, and let's talk thyroid. Before we get into the show today, I just want to say to those of you that are feeling overwhelmed and not too sure where to start with tackling your thyroid health from that diet and lifestyle point of view, then why not consider doing a strategy session with me? We can spend an hour together just trying to cut through all of the different information and work out what's the next best step for you, just to simplify it and get you started on a road to feeling better. So head to annabellebateman.com/strategy. I would love to do a session with you and just really help you get started. Well, welcome, Whitney, to the Let's Talk Thyroid podcast. I'm really excited to have you here on the show today.
Thanks, Annabelle. I'm super excited to be here. I've been looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. As I said just before, it is really nice to meet other people in this space, and maybe I've got the secret weapon with having the podcast. I get to connect, but just know there's lots of other fabulous people like you, and it's really lovely. So I'm enjoying that, and I've been following you on Instagram for a little while, and I think that's how I've been connecting with quite a few people actually.
And you are doing such a great job at putting so much fabulous content out there. I love what you're doing.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. It's been fun. It's almost a year. Actually, it's a year and a couple of weeks. And I think I'm just kind of I think it'll hit just before or just after 10,000 downloads on the podcast. So
awesome.
So I'm like, yay. I just sort of looked at that about a month ago. I'm like, I think that's going to coincide, which is just, I had no idea what to expect. I don't know if that's, good, bad, whatever. I think it's amazing, because when I look at what's 10,000 people, like it's fun. It's just been really fun. And
that's fantastic.
I know you're passionate about spreading, a positive message around thyroid health. So getting people like you on the show to contribute that was part of my mission. This podcast really is about connecting thyroid people, professionals, coaches, everyone all around the world. So it's good.
Good mission.
Yeah. So before we dive into all things gluten, which is what we're going to be talking about today, which I was thinking about as I was eating my paleo toast, I'm like, what? I actually don't really miss bread, but we can talk about that. Tell us a little bit about who is Whitney, what got you into this, why are you passionate about thyroid and gluten?
Sure. Well, I think like so many other practitioners in this space, my journey was a personal one. It all came from my own health journey, my own struggles, and which started, gosh, in my early 20s. Um, and my first real health crisis was panic attacks and
Mm.
anxiety, and then that just kind of steamrolled into other things. But over about 20 years, I ended up getting diagnosed with, let's see, psoriasis, interstitial cystitis, Hashimoto's, and then finally celiac disease.
Mhm.
So I am what I refer to as an autoimmune collector.
Well, that seems to be a trend, isn't it, with
It
autoimmune?
is a trend. It
Yeah.
is a trend. But every step along the way, I was very enmeshed in traditional medicine. I come from a medical background. A lot of people in my family are doctors, my father
Uh-huh.
and my mother.
Oh, wow.
So I was very much a Western medicine groupie,
Uh-huh.
had the answer to everything. And, after about 10 or so years of walking that path, I finally ran into a doctor that just kind of blew that perspective out of the water for me. He said something to me that just triggered me in such a way that I decided, I can't do this anymore. I can't, I can't seek my solution in Western medicine. It's just not, they don't have anything for me. So I just got off the path, and
Mm.
I went to acupuncture school. I started doing a lot of self-study in naturopathy and biomedicine and Western nutrition and stuff like that. And then I found functional diagnostic nutrition, and I got certified. And along the way, I was applying everything that I was learning to my own health, right? And to make a long story short, I reversed engineered so many things, so everything that the doctors told me, well, this is forever. There's no cure for this. You're just going to have to live with it and take this medicine and do this surgery or whatever. All of that ended up not being true,
Mm.
and then when I got my celiac diagnosis, that's really when everything became very illuminated for me, because once I got it, I was in this place of, I already had a pretty good foundation of what root cause investigation was all about. That symptoms are one thing, a diagnosis is one thing, but really the answer is to look for the root cause of that. What are the dominoes that
Yeah.
lined up for
How did we
you?
get there?
Yeah,
Like,
right, exactly.
yeah.
How did you get to where you are? It's very, very important. And once I was diagnosed with a celiac disease, which was very interesting because I had no GI presentations. I had
Aha.
no gastric, no no symptoms
Wow.
whatsoever.
That's really
And so
interesting.
I am what they call a silent celiac.
Ah,
And about roughly a third of people with celiac disease will present this way.
a
Right.
third. That's a
So a
lot.
third, which is why
Wow.
so many of us go undiagnosed for so long.
Yeah.
So for me, the first sign of my celiac disease was panic attacks.
Yeah.
Mine presented in the brain, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when I got that diagnosis, it was like, oh, now I found like one of these really core root causes, which was the celiac disease. That's the autoimmune disease that came first. I
Aha.
found it last, right?
Yep.
But it emerged first, and all of these other diagnoses were just offshoots of that, right?
Interesting.
So yeah, I mean, it really was. While I was doing that journey, of course, there was part of me going, why me? Why me? Oh my God, it's one thing after another.
Yep.
But now, that I'm on the other side of that, I think, wow, this is so great. I have all this experience. I've walked this path, and this has given me such a bigger purpose,
Yep.
in what I'm going to do with my life. And now my passion is all about, I don't want you to waste 20, 25 years trying to figure out how to reverse engineer what's going on with your health, right? Let's
Yep.
let's quicken that, right?
Yep.
Let's
Yeah.
hurry
Let's
up.
short
Let's
track it.
get it done. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's my summary of my
Yeah.
story.
That's really, it's interesting. And look, everyone's story, and when you've got a long story,
Yeah.
and actually, I haven't really talked to anyone with a short story. I don't
Right.
think even last week, well, my mum and dad were visiting recently, and I interviewed mum on the podcast, and she was only diagnosed with Hashimoto's 12 months ago.
Oh, wow.
So I was diagnosed when I was 23. So it's, I think I've had it since I was about 12. And I'm like, oh, genetic predisposition, blah, blah, blah. Well, I'm just this genetic anomaly. Where's everyone else in my family? And, sure enough, I knew I couldn't have been, but mum was diagnosed 12 months ago. So that's a fairly short sort of story, except that obviously the story goes way back. That's what I mean. No one has a short story. And she's like, now I look back and the more I read, and she was here reading some of my thyroid books, and like this, I don't know if you've read this one, Why Do I Still Have Thyroid
it's a great
Symptoms?
book.
I love Dr. Karatzi, and he's like
he's fantastic.
I don't know, my thyroid crush, I think, at least is but she was reading this, and she's like, I look back to when I was a teenager, and I think I saw signs back then. And I'm like, so no one really has a short autoimmune story.
No.
But when we have long stories like you've just described, I mean, you've just, like you said, to make a long story short, it's a long story. There's a lot of
story. Yeah.
Time, effort, research, pain, ups, downs that have happened in that time for you, I imagine.
Yeah. And I think the frustrating thing for most women who have those long stories is that every health practitioner and traditional practitioner, medical doctor they meet along the way looks at them through a very specific lens, right? It's their specialty. They look at their symptoms and they don't connect the dots. And so we end up getting, one diagnosis for this, and then one diagnosis for that, one pill for that, and one, and none of it is related. Right. And no one's connecting the dots.
Yeah.
And so we end up getting to a point where we feel like everything's wrong, right? So many different things are wrong. The wheels are just falling off the bus. Everything's falling apart. And I think in reality, it's just that there's a perfect storm brewing underneath that no one's identifying.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And so, it's all sort of seemingly all these disconnected things, but actually it's really connected. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that's what probably one of the reasons I like the way Dr. Karatzian talks about thyroid and autoimmune in general is that it's not, there's no quick fix. There's no simple solution. It's complex, it's lifelong, but there's lots of things that you can do to kind of navigate the different web. And I like that. It's because like what we've, what I've experienced, it sounds like what you have is there's so much hope. There's so many things we can do. But it is an ongoing thing. It's not an either or, it's both, and it's sort of navigating this path. And so like we're going to dive right into gluten, but that's one part, and so there's so many different parts. But that's the joy of, as we said before, a thyroid focused podcast is that we can dive deep into one specific aspect. So at a time. So let's just dive straight into gluten. Hey.
Okay. All right.
All right. I want to ask you a quick question first, and then I'll ask you a couple of gluten questions. But you mentioned before that you were diagnosed with Hashimoto's before the celiac. Were you already following a gluten-free diet for the Hashimoto's before you were diagnosed with celiac?
Well, yes and no. I was off and on. I didn't know enough about Hashimoto's at that time to understand the connection with gluten. But I had found the body ecology diet.
Oh yeah,
and I was working that, and
I think I've done that before.
And coincidentally, it's a gluten-free diet, right? So, and then I found the paleo diet, and I was doing that, which is so yes, I was gluten-free, and I was feeling better, but I didn't connect it to the gluten. Right? Because it's like, oh, this diet, I feel really good on this diet. I feel really good on this diet, but it wasn't, my brain wasn't focused on gluten until I got my celiac diagnosis. Then I really had this razor sharp focus on that because it just blew everything else out of the water.
That makes sense. Yeah. And there is actually a high correlation between those with Hashimoto's and celiac, isn't there?
Almost, well, there's an almost 100% correlation between Hashimoto's and either celiac disease or gluten sensitivity. So if you have Hashimoto's, there's 100% chance you have one of those things.
Yeah.
Right. So.
Yeah. Okay. So can you explain the difference then between gluten intolerance and celiac?
Sure. Yeah. And that's one of the confusing things. There's a lot of different lingo, right? So gluten sensitivity is probably the common term, at least in the US.
Okay.
Um, but the way I think about it is wheat sensitivity is the big umbrella. Okay. So if
Mm-hmm.
you think of the big umbrella of wheat sensitivity, then underneath that umbrella, you have celiac disease, you have non-celiac gluten sensitivity, right?
Yeah.
And celiac disease is a type of gluten sensitivity, right? But it's very specific because it is its own autoimmune disease that takes place. It's localized in the gut. So the good way for a Hashimoto crowd to think of it is, hey, my Hashimoto's means that my immune system is destroying tissue in my thyroid, right? Well, celiac disease means my immune system is destroying tissue in my gut. Okay.
Okay.
In response to gluten.
Yes.
So for 1% of the population, their gluten sensitivity or their wheat sensitivity manifests as celiac disease.
Right. Okay.
So, however, there is this misconception that celiac disease is just more serious. And I hear that all the time. Oh, well, yeah, I'm a little gluten sensitive, but I don't have celiac disease, as if that's makes it better. And what the research is showing us is that it doesn't. Gluten sensitivity is just as serious as celiac disease because it's the gateway to other much more serious diseases like multiple sclerosis or scleroderma or rheumatoid arthritis or type 1 diabetes, right? All of these things can cascade out of gluten sensitivity. So, I need to say that every time we talk about this because I want to completely blow up that myth that
Yeah.
celiac disease is the more serious thing,
Yeah,
right?
that's really helpful actually, because even, I mean, I've definitely said that. No, I don't have celiac, but I'm highly sensitive to
Right?
gluten. And I think often, I don't know what it's like in the States, but here, often if you're eating out,
Mm-hmm.
they'll say, I'll say gluten-free. Oh, are you celiac? Well, no, but so I think that maybe that's some of where
Yeah.
it on a practical level it plays out. You think, no, I'm not celiac, but I do have, like,
Exactly. And that kind of questioning, I think, perpetuates the misconception that celiac disease is more serious, right?
mm.
So, because what they're asking you
Or that
is
perhaps you have to be as meticulous.
exactly.
Yeah.
It's like saying, well, do you have a peanut allergy or are you just sensitive, right? It's like, oh, okay, well, celiac disease is more serious when the wait staff is asking you that, that's their perception, right? So I always tell my clients, tell them you have celiac disease. It's okay to lie about that. Just do it because gluten sensitivity is just as serious, but the rest of the culture hasn't caught up to that fact and they won't for
Mm.
another 10, 15 years, right?
Yeah.
So we need to use the language that's going to impress upon them the seriousness of our condition.
Yeah. So it really does matter. And I'm sure you hear people say this. I hear people say that, oh, I'm mostly gluten-free. Like, is there such a thing?
No,
Yeah.
no, there's not. It's like being kind of pregnant. No, there's no such thing. You're either gluten-free or you're not. And the reason for that is because even one small exposure to gluten will set off a cascade, an inflammatory cascade, and elevate your antibodies to gluten, right, for up to 6 months.
I know. When I heard that, that
So,
was like that final nail in the
right?
coffin. Like, it's not worth it. It's not
Yeah.
worth it. Not for 6 months worth of
So
inflammation.
it's
Yeah.
not worth it. It's not worth it. And I think a lot of people get into the habit of correlating the negative effects of gluten with their symptoms. And that's not true. It's like, so for you, maybe when you have gluten, okay, you have, really bad abdominal pain and gas and bloating for 3 or 4 days and then it's over. So it's easy to think, okay, well, I just had that gluten once and then 4 days later, everything's back to normal. No, that's just when your noticeable symptoms are over. But for your body, the inflammation continues, right? The immune response continues and it's systemic. And
Mm.
that's what shows up when we do the blood work.
Yeah. So tell me, because I've seen on your Instagram, you've talked quite a bit about this recently, and now it makes sense because you said that your celiac was the silent celiac and it wasn't
Yeah.
so much intestinal, but but the mood issues and
Mhm.
often brain. And so tell us, how can gluten sensitivity present itself?
Sure. Well, the first interesting thing is that the brain is the organ that is most commonly impacted by gluten. So, depression, anxiety, panic, um, foggy brain, just difficulty concentrating, poor recall, irritability, migraines, ADD, ADHD, other kinds of learning challenges, even more serious mood disorders like schizophrenia, right? And also like hallucinatory dreaming or lucid dreaming, sleep paralysis that kind of where there's kind of a hallucinatory component to it. Um, Lots of different presentations
Wow.
neurologically, right?
Yeah.
And then, the brain also impacts the peripheral nervous system too, right? So even peripheral neuropathy or tingling in the hands and feet, that's coming from the brain. And that's the gluten interaction with the brain. Other things are difficulty conceiving or being able to take a pregnancy to term. All skin issues you can think of, so psoriasis, dermatitis, eczema, stuff like that. And then you have your classic GI stuff, right? I mean,
Yep.
that's still there. Joint pain, so any pain, like hip pain or back pain, or any sort of arthritic pain. It's just the landscape of gluten sensitivity is everywhere, right?
Yeah. That's
So
whole
fatigue,
body, whole
yeah,
body.
the whole body. Just feeling fatigued can be your sign of gluten sensitivity, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I
yeah,
think that's really helpful because it is easy just to associate it with um, gut pain or bloating or, all
yeah,
of the gut issues.
yes,
And I think I realized, well, I continue, you continue to get epiphanies, don't you? The more I
yeah,
delve into this and the more I read and the more I talk to people, the more connections I make in my own health.
yes.
And I've had a brain lesion. So
Mm-hmm.
I've only had one. It hasn't progressed into MS, but that's demyelination.
Yeah.
And I've initially saw that, and I'm not too sure, maybe it's semantics. I saw it as a separate autoimmune issue.
Mm-hmm.
But the more I see it, I think it's connected to the
Sure.
Hashimoto's and the brain inflammation and yeah, it's interesting. And maybe it doesn't
I
really
see
matter,
it
but
that
I
way too.
see it
Yeah.
like that. The more I dig into it, the more I think, oh, I don't know if it's not separate. It's more and more connected than I had ever realized. Yeah.
I would agree with that, and I think that actually simplifies the situation when we're trying to solve our health problems. Is if you do see everything like that as being connected. Autoimmune disease, no matter where it's located, it's all coming from the same sort of level of dysfunction, right? I
Yeah.
mean, something is triggering your immune system to
Mm-hmm.
make a mistake and to attack, self tissue at an excessive rate, right?
Yeah.
Well, what's that trigger? And this is why women will start to collect more than one autoimmune disease, because it just kind of systemically travels through the body, this process, and it depends on where your weak link is. So
Mm-hmm.
if your weak link is the brain, yeah, MS. If the weak link is the joints, rheumatoid arthritis. If it's the skin, psoriasis. And sometimes, the more the body breaks down, the more weak links appear, and so you get these other autoimmune diseases.
Yeah. And is there is it more of a problem for women than for men?
It tends to be, yes. At least that's what the numbers say, right?
Yeah.
Women have a higher rate of autoimmune disease. They certainly have a much higher rate of
Oh,
Hashimoto's. Yeah,
completely.
I
Yeah.
mean, it's crazy.
Yeah.
But yeah, women tend to get more autoimmune diseases, and they tend to get more clusters of
Mm.
autoimmune diseases, right? And there are different um, explanations for that. It could be because we have a very, very nuanced endocrine system. We go through pretty big hormonal changes throughout our life. I mean,
Mm.
puberty, and then monthly cycles, and then menopause, and then pregnancy in there, maybe one, two, or more, right? So um, the hormonal piece of that can't be can't be set aside. I mean, we're very different creatures than men hormonally. And then there's also just the toxic exposure. Culturally, we are exposed to more toxins than men because we tend to use more products,
Yeah.
right? And makeup and hair dye and nail polish. And that's kind of changing. I think a lot of men are catching up to us in that. But for the last 100 or so years, we have been the consumers, the main consumers of products like that. And so we are exposed to a constant drip of chemicals at very low doses that are huge triggers for disease. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wonder too, anyway, no, I'm not going to ask that because that's going to get us off track, because I want to say we could go off in lots of different tracks. So I'm going to stick with the gluten. So can you explain, maybe not aside, but are there other aspects of issues between gluten and thyroid other than just what we've already talked about? Have we missed anything in that space?
Yeah, there's a couple very specific things. So the gluten protein is a very complex protein structure, and it has some molecular mimicry or just similarity with other protein structures. Some of them are other foods, but coincidentally, it looks a lot like thyroid tissue. So when your immune system is traveling around the bloodstream, it's taking snapshots of different proteins, and it's looking for bad guys. It's on patrol. It doesn't have a whole lot of time to investigate. So it's taking snapshots of little bits and pieces of these long strands of protein. Well, because there's such a similarity between a big part of the thyroid protein strand and the big part of the gluten strand, the immune system can make a mistake, and then it tags your thyroid tissue with the gluten tag. Now, every time that patrol comes out and it sees your thyroid, it goes, oh, bad guy, boom, let's kill it, right? So that's that molecular mimicry going on. Another thing that happens is gluten contains a toxic lectin called wheat germ agglutinin. And this lectin is very, very destructive for the gut lining. It just kind of like punches holes in the gut lining. Then it gets through the gut lining, goes into the bloodstream, and it really likes to attach to different organs and tissues. And one place where it commonly likes to hang out is on the thyroid. So it's this sticky little protein, and it gets on the thyroid, and the immune system sees it and goes, oh yeah, you don't belong there. Boom, boom, boom. Starts to eradicate that lectin, and then the thyroid tissue around it gets destroyed due to collateral damage, right? So that's two specific ways that gluten interacts with thyroid.
Yeah. And when it comes to, I'll ask a different question first. So no, what do I want to ask you? Let's talk about gluten cross-reactivity.
Sure.
So it's, as I understand it, I mean, I tend to have a bit of an issue with grains in general, not just gluten, not just gluten containing grains, but grains in general. And as I understand it, I mean, that's really gluten cross-reactivity. Can you explain that a little bit for people who might not know what that means?
It's kind of the same thing that we were talking about. There's this mimicry. There's this similarity between gluten or wheat, right, and other foods, where the immune system looks at the protein structure and goes, oh, that looks a lot like gluten. Boom, I'm going to tag it with the gluten tag, right? So those foods are dairy, specifically cow dairy, rice, corn, millet, yeast, meaning baker's yeast and brewer's yeast, and oats. Okay. Now, oats, there's still some discussion as to whether or not oats classically cross-react, but oats are a very common source of contamination, of being contaminated with gluten. So some practitioners say it's safe to eat oats if they're certified gluten-free. Other practitioners say, yeah, you should never eat oats if you're gluten sensitive. It's just too risky. And I happen to be in that other camp. I just say, no, just don't do the oats whatsoever.
Yeah, I don't do oats either.
Yeah, it's just too risky. And so what will happen is people will get their celiac diagnosis or their gluten sensitivity diagnosis, and they'll say, okay, well, I'm going gluten-free. And they do all the hard work. They're gluten-free for 6 months and they don't feel any better. They feel like crap. Well, part of that is because they have continued to eat and even increase their consumption, right, of cross-reactive foods. Their consumption of corn goes up, their consumption of rice goes up, right? And sometimes even their consumption of dairy goes up, because a lot of these gluten-free foods are trying to compensate for the lack of gluten. And so they really ramp up all these other ingredients, right? So we're replacing all of these things with foods that cross-react. So we still feel bad because our immune system still thinks we're eating gluten.
Yeah.
And it responds appropriately, right? I mean, we get inflamed, whatever autoimmune disease we have continues to progress, there's excess tissue destruction, and it's because of the corn now, or it's because of the rice now, not the gluten. And then people will say, okay, well, I don't feel any better, so therefore gluten's not my problem. I don't believe that I'm gluten sensitive. I'm going to go back to eating gluten. And then they're just back to where they started.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you generally recommend people where do you recommend people start? So if someone's listening to this and they're like, haven't really been convinced on the gluten-free thing, and I still know lots and lots of people with thyroid issues that aren't convinced or don't want to be convinced or haven't gone or just don't know yet that gluten is something to avoid. So where do you suggest people start?
Well, I think the best place to start is get the data, right? I mean, you need the hard data in front of you. So, I mean, I'm a bit of a tough love coach. So when people say to me, I don't have a problem with gluten, gluten's not my issue, I say, prove it, right? Let's run the labs and let's see. 99% of the time we find they do have a problem. They're getting exposed, they're super inflamed, their antibodies are up. So if you know you're gluten sensitive, then you need to get a test at least once a year to check your antibodies. That's if you are trying to be gluten-free, right?
Yeah.
You have to test yourself to make sure that you're successful at being gluten-free.
Oh, I 100% agree.
It's
Yeah.
because it's hard to know. You can't use your body, your symptoms as your guidepost. It doesn't work that way.
So are you saying that gluten sensitivity is reflected in thyroid antibody levels, or it's as in that's the test, or
No,
there are other tests, or what?
no, I mean specifically gluten antibodies.
Oh, I
So
see. Oh, I'm
yes,
with you. Okay.
so you need to run like I run a test called the wheat zoomer on every single client who comes to see me. Then we do the wheat zoomer right out of the gate. I want to see what's your current level of exposure, and what parts of the gluten and the wheat protein are you reacting to, because it gives me a lot of information. Even those clients who say to me, Whitney, I've been gluten-free for 5 years, there's no way I'm getting contaminated, we still run the test, because again,
Right.
prove it. Let's make sure, because if we don't confirm that and we just take it off faith that you're not getting micro exposures, well, then we're just jumping down a bunch of other rabbit holes that are going to cost you a lot of money, when really we can be digging into this gluten issue that you still have going on, but we don't know about it because you're not testing, right?
Yeah. And is that like I know that it's probably a little bit different between the US and here in Australia, but is that a common test? Is that something a doctor can prescribe or refer to? I mean, I know they may not, but can they, or is that something? Tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah, it's not something that has filtered into traditional medicine.
Okay.
So if most people, if they say to their doctor, I want to be evaluated for gluten sensitivity, their doctor's going to run a celiac panel. Okay. And which is evaluating them for a very specific type of gluten sensitivity. And if you're gluten sensitive and you don't have celiac disease, and that panel is going to come back negative, right? Then the doctor says, no, you don't have a problem with gluten, everything's fine. But you can't test for gluten sensitivity using the traditional celiac tests. You can't do it.
Okay.
Right. So that's why most people go undiagnosed with gluten sensitivity, because they're getting the wrong test in the first place.
Right.
So there are 2 tests on the market right now in the States. that adequately screen for gluten sensitivity. One is made by Cyrex Laboratories,
Yep.
and it's called the Cyrex Array 3.
Yep.
And then the other is the Wheat Zoomer from Vibrant Wellness Labs.
Okay. So that's, yeah. Well, and I might see if I can do a little digging in Australia to see if there's what the equivalent would be here, because that's, yeah, I've certainly heard of Cyrex Labs.
Yes.
Yeah, and I've heard of some of those things. So it's interesting. I'll have to have a look and see here. So yeah, that's really helpful information, because as you say, well, you don't know what you don't know. And once you know, then that helps you to really understand why.
Yeah, absolutely. And some folks will say, well, why should I bother testing? I can just give up gluten and then see if that fixes things or see how I feel. That is a strategy, and some of my clients will opt for that. But I still say, well, that's okay. You can just give up gluten and go gluten-free, but we're still going to run the test 6 months from now. Because
Yeah.
again, we have to confirm that you're being successful, because we can't rely on your symptoms to tell us.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's helpful, because I think when I heard, the way I interpreted antibodies was thyroid antibodies, not
Right.
gluten antibodies.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
interesting. So that's helpful. Right. So Tess, so when someone comes to you, like, let's get the panel done. Let's understand the starting point. And so do you just go hardcore, cold turkey, cut it out? Where do you recommend?
Yeah. Well, I will run labs that will look at their wheat, dairy, corn, and rice reactivity. Those are the main ones that people are getting contaminated with. And so we'll get a lay of the land, right? See what's
Yep.
going on, right? What
Yep.
are you reacting to? And for most people, I say, it really is best to, let's say they are reactive to dairy, corn, and wheat. Most people are, if they're gluten sensitive. Then I say, okay, you need to get gluten and dairy and corn out of your house, completely out of your house, right? And then 6 months down the road, we're going to run the same labs. We're going to make sure that you've been successful at doing that. But I think the optimum thing that I try and kind of transition people into is a grain-free diet. I don't think your house needs to be completely grain-free, but your house needs to be gluten-free. If you have cross-reactivities, it also needs to be free of those cross-reactive proteins. And then a grain-free diet in general is going to give your gut and your immune system the best chance of healing, at least for a good 4 to 6 months.
Yeah. Yeah. So the gradual approach, not so keen on.
Yeah, I don't really do gradual.
No, I don't either. But
Yeah.
what I've noticed with some people is that I'm a bit all or nothing, go hard, go home. I think
I
that's a
am too.
thyroid thing. And so actually
Yeah.
a lot of people with thyroid are like that. So it's okay. But there are people that take time. And when I think about it, for me, now I've been, gluten-free for I think it's about 7 or 8 years. And now it's easy, but I have to remind myself that it wasn't easy. And I did dabble in, I'd be gluten-free, then I wouldn't. And then because I wasn't, going back then, I wasn't connecting non-gut symptoms,
Right.
and so I was like, well, I'm not crippled over with pain when I eat gluten. And so I'd be on and off and on and off. And so I have to remind myself that it took me a good few years, and like probably 10 years from when someone first said go gluten-free. I'm like, what?
Yeah.
You've got to be joking. Like what, so that's sort of 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So it did take me time to get to this point. And I have to remember that when, maybe there's a lot more information now, which makes it perhaps easier. And it's definitely easier to eat out gluten-free and buy gluten-free and live gluten-free than it was 20 years ago. So I think there's a lot of things that have made it easier. But like I've noticed that, but yes, I agree, but I have noticed that sometimes people aren't quite ready to do that.
Yeah. And I don't want to be misunderstood, because it's not like you have to make this huge transformational change overnight, right? You just need to make the decision.
Yeah.
Right. It's the decision that's important. It's the commitment. It's like, okay, yes, I am going to eliminate gluten from my life. That's what you need to do. And then you can start the process of actually implementing that. And that process can take anywhere from 5 weeks to 5 months, right?
Yeah. I
Because
like that.
it
Yeah,
takes
that's
time.
good. It does
But
take
it's the
time.
decision that has to be there.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you'll never do the work.
Yeah.
That process will be that stop and start, right?
Yeah. And I
Yeah,
often say the decision is 90% of the problem, 95,
absolutely.
99%. Once you've
Yeah.
made the decision,
Yes.
well, then the decision's made. And I was saying this to a
Mhm.
lady in a session earlier in the week, and we were talking quite a lot about gluten, and she'd sort of dabbled in the past and was like, no, I'm really ready to go for it now. I'm like, great. And I said, well,
Yeah.
that's part of, now that you've made the decision, that's like most of the problem gone, because you're
Yes.
not weighing up every time you eat out. Oh, do I have that cake? Oh, do I not? Well, you don't even look. You just look, okay, what's gluten-free? Okay, they're my choices.
That's
It's
right.
so freeing, actually. It sounds
It
like it's
is.
restrictive, but actually it's freeing, because every day, every mouthful, you're not kind of pulling and arguing with yourself. So
Oh, yeah. I feel that way every time I go to the grocery store, every time I go to a restaurant. It's like all the things I don't even have to look at anymore.
yeah,
It simplifies my
it
life.
does. It sounds, I think when you're on the other side, it sounds super restrictive. But once you've
Yeah.
gotten
Yeah.
through that, you've made that decision, you've gotten through, it's like,
Hmm.
oh my gosh, this is liberating. And
Yes.
yeah, it does make
Yeah.
a difference. And one of the things, I'm sure you've heard of this, but that I also found helpful in really understanding why it's so hard, it can be really
Mhm.
hard to give up gluten, is the addictive nature of gluten.
Yes.
Is
It's
that
very
something? Yeah.
addictive. And that is, and that's a very chemical thing. Gluten interacts with the opioid receptors in our brains. So, and for some people, that interaction is very, very intense. And so when you give up gluten, it is like a chemical withdrawal. It's like going into a drug withdrawal. It literally is. Your whole body can feel achy, and you can feel awful, you can feel irritable, you can cry, you can, all of these things. You can just feel terrible for 3 or 4 weeks, but
Mm.
that's because of that chemical withdrawal. And the flip side of that too is that interaction with the opioid receptors also has a very medicating, numbing effect. So for
Mm.
some people, particularly who are very sensitive to gluten in this way, they will feel better when they eat it. So when they're really stressed, or they're sad, or they're going through an emotional time, or they'll reach for something that has wheat in it, and when they eat it, they feel numbed. They feel like, okay, the pressure's off, my brain is quieted down, my nervous system is quieted down. It's kind of like how some people have a glass of wine, right?
Mm.
I just
It's a
feel less
comfort. It
stressed
is
for
a
a while.
comfort
It's a
food.
comfort. It's a
It's a
comfort.
definite comfort.
But it's a drug. I mean, you feel that way. That response isn't because, oh, that's what my body needed in that moment. That response is a chemical drug response in the brain, right?
Mm.
So it's not particularly healthy, but it's highly addictive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think when I understood that, which was after I'd given up gluten,
Hmm.
but I think I fall into that category. And it was really helpful to understand that, because it can be hard to give up gluten. And I think the reason,
Yes.
when you think of it like giving up a drug, I think it makes you a bit kinder on yourself when you're in that process, because
Yeah.
you can go, well, this is hard. My body is withdrawing from this. This is,
Yeah.
and so this is a good sign, like I'm ripping the Band-Aid off. We're getting
Yeah.
there. But
Yeah.
I don't know if you've noticed this, but for me, like, having, I don't know, I think I've spent 30 years of my life on a diet.
Mm.
So what I noticed about 6 to 12 months after I had given up gluten was that I didn't feel as addicted to food in general.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Yeah.
it definitely has transformed my relationship with food, my body
Yeah.
image, I don't and there's been other things over time, but when I understand about that addiction, the gluten kind of that opioid response, I'm like, well, that sort of, in retrospect, that made sense. That, yeah, that
Yeah.
whole addictive nature of standing at the pantry and shoving things in, or like
Right.
clawing for food, or what am I eating next? And I still love food and I love cooking and I love eating, but it doesn't have the same hold on me that it used to.
Yeah, right. And part of that too is also chemical, I think, because gluten is very powerful. Wheat in general is very powerful because it disrupts some of our hormone signaling.
Hmm.
And so it can actually kind of, mess up those hunger and satiety hormones. And so we feel hungrier than we normally would, or it takes us longer to feel satiated
Mm.
because we're continuing to get this steady drip, drip, drip of wheat into the body. And that just disrupts all those hormones. And it can also keep us from burning fat. Right. So we just feel heavier and more inflamed in our bodies. And a
Mm.
lot of women, I work primarily with women. So a lot of my clients will, once they go off gluten, after they've been off gluten for maybe a month or so, they just notice the weight is just coming off, and they're like, how is this happening? I'm not doing anything different. It's like, well, actually, your hormones are recovering
Mm.
from being off gluten, right? All that time on gluten and wheat, the hormones were disrupted, and now they're regaining their balance and being more efficient, and your metabolism is starting to come back online.
Yeah, yeah. It's so fascinating. We're such
Yeah.
intricate body, mind, spirit connected kind
Yeah.
of beings, aren't we? And so
Yeah.
and yeah, I think then the other sort of maybe the more like tying in with that emotional connection to gluten, and maybe the, well, I sort of was thinking about it when I was talking to mum, because we were talking about all the different things, and my mum's a big foodie, and that was a lot. That's been hard for her. Making dietary
Mhm.
changes has been hard, and it's an ongoing thing, and I think
Yeah.
it's hard for all of us. And so we
Yeah.
were talking about the grief, like it's like a
Yeah.
constant, like a grieving process, and
It
you kind of
is.
get through gluten, and then I mean, for her, it was like she's been gluten-free solidly for about the last year, 18 months, and now she's working on the grains. And it's like this,
Mhm.
we talked a bit about like a constant grieving, like there's always something. It feels like, can feel like,
Yeah.
yeah, is that something you've found in your work?
Absolutely.
It's
I
a
think there's
grieving
a
process.
cycle. There's a cycle, and I actually call it the coping cycle, and I talk about it in. I have a mini course that teaches people how to, um, like eliminate gluten from their life, right? And part of what I talk about is this cycle, and the first phase of the coping cycle is the grief,
Mm-hmm.
and there's so much attached. As a culture, we have so much emotion and symbolism and love and connection that revolves around food in general. But I'd say at the pinnacle of that is really wheat. Wheat
Yeah.
is just iconic when it comes to the emotional cultural space that it takes up for all of us, right?
Yeah.
And so when you have to give that up, it's almost as if you are separating yourself from the human race. It's like you've become an
Mm.
other, like you're standing outside, you no longer belong, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And 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 then there's that flip side where the people in your life who love you are looking at you as if, well, wait a minute, what are you doing here? You're rocking the boat, right? So they also see you as not belonging, right?
Mm.
In a reactionary sort of way. It can be super, super isolating. And then there's this next phase of yearning, it's like yearning of that life before, right? I mean, and idealizing the life when you could eat gluten, right? And that's that hanging on, right?
Mm.
Hanging on to that past. And most of my clients go through those two phases for quite some time, and it's a huge struggle, and a
Yeah.
lot of it depends upon their support system,
Yeah.
and how responsive their support system is. And it also depends on how they're wired. I
Yeah.
mean, some
Yeah.
people
Yeah. Of
just like
course.
this is how it is, right?
Yeah.
And they're wired to be a little more in your face about it, and so they maybe get through those two phases a little
Mm.
more quickly. And then there's the reorganization phase, and that's where you're starting to make changes and substitutions, and like all those comfort foods, right, that we love so much. You start to recreate them in a new form,
Yeah.
right? Finding recipes and making new routines and new rituals, and so you're
Mm.
reorganizing your life, right? And then there's the I think the final phase, which is where you really are, you've mastered it, and that comes from, I think, most people who get there because they start to educate themselves, right? They start to find their communities and read books and learn the science behind why gluten isn't good for them and all the things it does to their body, and which really builds their confidence and gives them a foundation, a reason why I'm continuing to do this, right? Gives
Mm.
them the tools to stand firmly in their convictions and come from a place of power, right? And really embrace this new world. And when you get to that place, then everything opens up,
Yeah.
right? But it's hard to see that that's possible
Yeah.
when you're in that first phase of just deep in grief,
Yeah. So
right?
true.
It's
Yeah.
really hard. So it's important for coaches like myself and for all of us who have walked this path to let people know, yeah, I know where you are. I've been there. I've been in that hole, and I know the way out. And this is what's waiting for you on the other side. And it really is great. Um, it can be hard to believe,
Yeah.
but yeah, that is definitely a cycle. It is there for
Yeah.
every single person that goes through
Yeah.
this. Yeah.
And I think then and then it cycles again. So then it's like, oh, well, if you don't do it all, maybe this is the maybe this is the benefit of
Yeah.
doing it all at once. Um, and for me, I would say I follow a paleo-ish style of diet. That's sort of the way
Hmm.
I describe. But,
Yeah.
I did all the gluten and the grains, and the dairy was the last thing. But I think, so you go through it all again, and
Yes.
it's that constant,
Yeah.
that grieving cycle, but you get out the other end and then you look back and you think, oh, that wasn't so hard. And so I suppose, yeah, I love the way that you just described that. I think that's really helpful. And your course, I know you mentioned the course before, the gluten
It's called
gauntlet mini course, and you've
yeah,
got
the gluten
maybe let's
gauntlet.
talk about that now. And you've got a special discount code for anyone that's listening.
Yeah, it's really, I developed it because so much of what I do with clients is coaching them through this process
Mm,
of eliminating gluten from their lives and really trying to create a safe space for themselves in their homes, and also trying to increase their safety when they go out in the world, like restaurants and friends' houses, and how to cope with different events like potlucks. And I mean, all of these things come up, right? So I eventually decided, I'm just going to put everything into this course.
mhm.
And so I created the Gluten Gauntlet mini course, and it's designed to teach people how to eliminate gluten from their lives in 5 weeks. And it's really focused on the home, right? Because that's really the only thing we have control over. We
Yeah,
don't have control over the outside world.
yeah.
So making your house the safest place it can be for you. And I take you through not only the first lesson, I think, is the most important because it's about talking to your family, getting support, having those conversations, getting those agreements and those compromises and strategies with the people
Mm,
who are closest to you and who are sharing your space,
yeah.
right? That's a really tough place for
It's
people.
so important, that support team. I've just been
Yeah.
writing about that, for a book that I'm writing, and they're building your support team. And I mean, there's so many different aspects, but that in your home, yeah, can be the hardest, but it's
It
also
can
probably they're all important, but it's so important.
it's where there's the most opportunity for support, but
Mm,
people need in my experience, my clients have needed help. How do I talk to my family about
yeah,
this?
that's right.
Right? How
Yeah.
do I present this and not get automatic resistance, right?
Mhm.
What's the best strategy for that? And then once that's over, then it's just about logistics, right? It's
Yeah.
going through the kitchen, going through the pantry, getting rid of certain kitchenwares that you have to replace. And then it's going out into the rest of your house. What about your personal care products and your cleaning products and
Yeah.
even weird stuff like your dental retainer, that could have gluten in it,
Oh,
right?
right. Wow.
Or
Yeah.
your Invisalign braces. Yeah, it
Oh,
could,
right.
right?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, because gluten, there's a part of gluten that's a plasticizer. It's used in
Oh,
like mouth guards and things like that.
okay.
So, there's a lot of weird places where you can get contaminated that you don't think about.
Yeah.
So that's what my course is all about. And so part of it's video and part of it's just a lot of resources, and it just walks you through every step of the process. And then there's an opportunity too for people to just kind of like give me feedback, ask me questions, get some assistance throughout the course. So
Yeah, sounds fabulous. So yeah, if you're interested in that, yeah, Whitney's very generously offering a 50% discount when you use, I'll pop it in the show notes, but the code is Annabelle, ANNABEL 50. Is that right?
yes, with a capital A at the
Capital
beginning.
A. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Excellent. So Annabelle 50. I like, that's great. So thank you. That's wonderful. And there's another download that I'll link to too about understanding and interpreting your thyroid blood test, that's a whole nother conversation.
That's a
So
whole
we
other
might save that one for
conversation.
another one.
Yes.
But
Yes.
yeah, so we might save that. But the link is definitely worth downloading. I've had a good look at it, and it's some really helpful information in there. So and so where else can people get in touch with you, Whitney? Like if people want to connect with you?
Sure. Whitney Morgan Nutrition. So that's my website. That's my Instagram. That's my Facebook.
Excellent.
So all across the board.
Wonderful. Keep it simple. That I like that. Yeah, we'll definitely link to all of that. And look, I think we've covered lots of really helpful information. It's been really lovely talking to you. But is there something I haven't asked you that you think the audience need to know? There might not be. We might have covered, but if there's something obvious.
Let's see.
Or a lasting word that you would, like to leave with people.
Golly. Well, I guess I just can't say this enough, which is, I've worked with dozens and dozens of women with Hashimoto's, and 99% of them are gluten sensitive or they have celiac disease. And of course, as you know, we already talked about, I run the tests on them because we need to confirm that they're successful. And what my experience teaches me is that you're not gluten-free unless your house is gluten-free. So that is my message to everyone out there. Please, please, please just forget about the idea that you can create this gluten-free bubble around yourself in your house and everybody can go about eating what they want to and you just don't inconvenience anyone else. You will end up getting contaminated often enough that you will keep your body in a state of inflammation ongoing, and you'll just have a very difficult time healing. So that is what my experience tells me. So that is, I am just on a mission to shatter that myth that you can be gluten-free in a house where gluten is still walking in the door.
Oh, well, okay. Well, there's a message for me because my house is not gluten-free. Anyway, yeah, that's really interesting. And it's good. This is why I love this, because I'm challenged too. Like I'm constantly learning. I've learned a few things in talking to you, and I think it's great. It's great. I'm happy to be challenged, and it's good.
And Annabelle, I think for so many of us, we're mothers, right? And the reality is that gluten sensitivity runs in families, and it doesn't show up the same for our kids as it does for us. So if you are gluten sensitive as a mom, one of the best, most beautiful gifts you can give your children is a gluten-free house and a gluten-free life, at least at home.
Yeah, I know. And I think,
I know.
Three teenage boys. I tell you, this is my approach. So this is just me being honest, right? Because in the end, we're all going to live our lives. This is not,
that's right.
I'm not perfect. The way I try to do it is like, I am gluten-free. I buy, and I would just say we're lower gluten, but I take your point about the cross-reactivity. And I think because for me, and I know I have the celiac gene. It hasn't been triggered, so I don't have celiac, but I know I've got that I know I have the gene. But I haven't probably been as meticulous about some of those obvious,
right.
That if I was a celiac, that. And so,
Yes.
yeah, okay. And so that's really good food for thought for me. And with my kids, like I'll buy gluten-free pasta, but they still have bread and wheat bix. And, they're 3 teenage boys that have a lot of carbs and they need a lot of filling. And, and so, yeah, but I'm mindful. So it's just, I suppose I sit somewhere trying to balance it and not, but I'm alert,
Yes.
I'm alert.
So let me ask you this, when your boys are grown and out of the house, do you think you'll live in a gluten-free house after that?
Oh, that's a good question. I would say more so, like
Good.
95%. Yeah, I would say.
Good. Okay.
And because Lee he just eats what I give him, basically.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's there, but if gluten wasn't in the house, I don't think he would go looking for it. He would be largely gluten-free just by osmosis.
Yes.
I would say that, the gluten that I like, the bread and the things that come into the house it's not that he doesn't eat it, but it's predominantly for the kids. It's
the boys.
Yeah. So, but there's certainly room for maybe incremental. I think I would need to do that incrementally for them at this point, but we'll see. I've got one little story actually, and then we'll wrap up because talking about the that family support and the feeling different or isolated, or but a number of years ago, probably reasonably early on in my gluten-free journey, Lee and I we went to Sydney for a weekend away, and we went to this like cabaret show. And it was dinner and a show and like cabaret, and then everyone sitting at their own little tables, and every sort of act of the show there was a different course of food attached to it. And it was funny. It was a very kind of eye-opening kind of, I realized I'm fairly sheltered, like little cabaret show, and I had this man in the toga kind of stripping down to pretty much nothing right next to me. But anyway, it was a whole lot of fun. But I had requested a gluten-free meal, which was no problem, but because of the way that they were doing, all the waiters were just sort of delivering these sort of set meals in between all of the shows. So when I sat down, I get this sort of laminated plastic, placemat that says on there with a big smiley face, "I'm special." And so when they're bringing around all the food, clearly that meant I've got a special meal. And so they'd be like, "Whoa, okay, we're not giving that one to you." And so ever since then, we just have this bit of a joke. He says, "You're special. You're really special." So like, yeah, that's me. I'm special. So.
You're special. You are special, Annabelle.
Yeah. So, but it was
That's great.
It was pretty funny. Well, thank you, Whitney. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and and connecting with you. And it's been full of lots of information. So I'm looking forward to getting it out there and sharing it with everyone.
Great. Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for watching this episode of Let's Talk Thyroid. I would love it if you enjoyed it, if you would hit subscribe and the bell. That would be really helpful. Even more helpful actually would be to share it with someone else who you know has thyroid issues or you think would benefit from listening. That really is part of my mission, I suppose, is to spread the message of positive and practical approach to managing your thyroid health so that people really kind of have more energy to get on with living their life and not just kind of trudging through each day. So spreading that word really genuinely helps other people feel better, live better, be better. The best way that you can connect with me is through my website, which is annabellebateman.com. From there, really, you'll be able to connect in all the other ways. I would love it if you would join my Facebook community group. There's lots of great support there. It's all free. That's just being with like-minded people. But from the website, you can also book a strategy session with me. So if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed, not too sure where to start, then book a strategy session. There's also freebies to download and links to look at my online courses or purchase some essential oils or my cookbook. So that's really the hub, would be annabellebateman.com. But look forward to connecting with you and just being in this thyroid health journey together. Have a great day. Bye.
The information presented and discussed in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease and should not be used as a substitute for proper advice from a qualified professional.